All right. We'll go ahead and start. Laura, I don't know if you can pull the slides back up on that, but welcome everyone to our latest installment of our energy storage at PNNL webinar. And in this webinar, what we're really trying to do is to highlight some of the research that's going on at PNNL to support energy storage and look at how that ties into the new grid storage launchpad that's being built here at PNNL, planning to open in 2023. So today we're fortunate enough to have Jeremy Twitchell join us to talk about state policy trends in energy storage. And this really plays into GSL because the way that we're going to accelerate that next generation of technologies is understanding what their use case is, how they are, and instilling that all the way throughout the development cycle. So instead of testing in the lab, and developing it without any idea of the final application, we're trying to get those applications into the development cycle. So you're testing all along the way and understanding where these systems are going to be used and what are the future use cases are going to be critical for us. And so we're really happy to have Jeremy join us today to kind of present on his research. So Jeremy joined PNNL in 2018, and he is responsible for the equitable regulatory environment component of the DOE's Office of Electricity Energy Storage Program. In that role, he conducts research and publishes technical reports identifying the barriers for energy storage in traditional regulatory practices and what alternate approaches there may be to help eliminate those barriers. Jeremy also operates a technical assistance program that helps states that are trying to incorporate energy storage into their policies and regulatory practices. Prior to joining PNNL, Jeremy spent 5 years with the Washington Utilities and Transportation Commission, and where he oversaw energy efficiency programs and resource planning processes, led rulemaking on renewable portfolio standards and integrated resource planning, and provided testimony on cost allocation, rate design, and resource prudence. He advised the Commission on utility rate making and regulatory rulemaking, and led the development of a policy statement that provided guidance to utilities on the inclusion of energy storage in integrated resource planning. Jeremy has a master's in public service and administration from Texas A&M and a bachelor's in communications from Brigham Young University. It is my pleasure to welcome Jeremy, and Jeremy, we'll let you take it away.
All right, thanks, Vince. Is that coming through all right?
You're coming through fine.
All right. All right, well, thank you for that kind introduction. So as Vince mentioned, I'll be talking about what states are doing on energy storage policy around the country, some of the trends we're seeing, some of the lessons we're learning, and some of the future opportunities that are presenting themselves. So I just want to begin by saying that all the work that I'm presenting today and our ability to do this work and share this work with everyone is funded by the Department of Energy through the Office of Electricity's Energy Storage Program, which is led by Dr. Imre Zsuk, and we're grateful for their support for these efforts. So quick agenda for today. We'll talk first about some of the deployment trends for energy storage that we're seeing. 2021 was a very big year. So we'll kind of break that down and just see what lessons we can learn and what data we can pull out of the deployment that we saw in 2021. Then we'll talk through the various types of policies that states are enacting around energy storage. There's lots of different ways about addressing storage issues, and we'll talk through those. Then we'll talk about how those policies have evolved over time and how states are starting to ask storage to do a lot more, to do new and creative things to support the grid and to support customers. Then finally, we'll talk about some of those emerging objectives that states are just starting to identify and some future opportunities for where state policymaking can provide additional guidance. So deployment trends. So 2021 was a very big year for energy storage. We installed a little more than 3,100 megawatts of storage in 2021, which was double the amount that we had installed in all years previous combined. So very big year, but In addition to seeing deployment rates start to speed up, you're also seeing on the bottom there how policy activity at the state level and at the federal level has really started to accelerate as well. And that's just an eye chart, no need to strain at all those different policies. We'll talk through a lot of those in the presentation. But just to kind of capture that, you know, as this market gets bigger, interest around this market gets bigger and states are getting more and more creative and deliberate about what they're asking storage to do. So in addition to putting a lot more storage on the grid in 2021, the storage that we were putting there was longer duration. So we're not only are we putting a lot more capacity on the grid, we're putting a lot more energy storage content on the grid as well. You can see that the average duration of new storage projects has kind of bounced around, but remained pretty low for many years. Then it jumped up to 3.3 megawatt hours per project in 2021. Or excuse me, 3.3 hours of duration, I should say. Couple things driving this. So 75% of all the storage that we saw installed in 2021 went to 2 states, 57% to California, 18% to Texas. In California, their resource adequacy requirements are driving virtually all the energy storage projects that are going in there to be 4 hours. In Texas, on the other end of the spectrum, where they're still focused on ancillary service markets and energy markets, most of the storage that went in Texas was only 1 hour. So you can kind of see those two extremes pulling on each other. And that 2021 data isn't quite yet final, but it's pretty reliable. It's a pretty good indicator of what the final numbers will be when the EIA releases those next month. You know, storage costs are they're still coming down, but those declines are starting to level off over the last couple of years. You know, really, it's just getting down to it can only get so cheap. You know, there's only so far that those costs can fall. We're starting to kind of reach that point with lithium ion. We've seen prices fall about 80% since 2013. You know, 2022 is going to be interesting, you know, with the supply chains being what they are. It's really tough to say what prices will look like in 2022. I was talking to a developer yesterday who said they're seeing, you know, pretty wild price swings on a bi-weekly basis when it comes to purchasing new storage infrastructure. So, you know, it's really uncertain what those final numbers are going to look like in 2022. Another thing to keep in mind is that while these costs for the energy storage cells and the pack are coming down and have come down precipitously, they still only represent a fraction of the total cost of installing an energy storage system. You have to remember that you've got, you know, HVAC equipment, you've got to interconnect the thing to the grid, you have to commission it, you have to have all the necessary controls and software. So when we're talking about these falling cell and pack costs, that's been a great story for energy storage. But it does only represent about 20 to 30% of the total system cost, you know, just kind of depending on the site specific costs. So different types of state policies. Just want to say up front that we maintain a website at PNNL, the Energy Storage Policy Database, where we're trying to track what's going on at the state level, you know, all the different things that states are doing, and then just provide links to, you know, what's driving that, whether it was, you know, a commission order or an act of the legislature or an executive order, you know, whatever that foundational document was that set that policy. We also put out an article a few years ago where we kind of described these 5 types of policies that we look at, the 5 ways of breaking them down. So we look at procurement targets, we look at regulatory adaptations, demonstration programs, financial incentives, and interconnection incentives. And we'll talk through each one of those in a little more detail. So on procurement mandates, you know, the idea here is that if we build more of a thing, in this case, energy storage, as we build more, we learn how to do it better and the costs come down. So what you see on the right there is just, you know, the deployment data that we were looking at a few slides ago in orange. You can see it spiking up in 2021. And the cost data that we saw a couple slides ago, how that's come down. Important note, those cost declines we're seeing, you know, grid energy storage deployment is only a part of that story. Obviously, you know, the EV industry and all the EV batteries that are being built are really the driving, pun absolutely intended, the driving force behind those cost declines. But to the degree that stationary grid energy storage projects have also ramped up, they do play a role in driving those costs down. You know, and as an example of this, so California's initial mandate of 1,325 megawatts would have taken us to about here on the deployment curve. And then, so, if we look at how much the cost declined at that point on the deployment curve, the California mandate has a role in driving those costs down. It's difficult to say exactly how much. We actually have a project right now where we're trying to quantify how much of these costs, how many of the degree to which these cost reductions can be attributed to the California mandate. But the basic idea here is that if we think that our normal course of business isn't going to deploy this technology because it's too expensive, by forcing some of it to be deployed, we drive that cost down and we make it more cost competitive. And so we've seen these mandates adopted or pending in 11 states now. The second kind of policy we look at is regulatory adaptation. This is where the state or the utility commission is changing the way that it regulates the grid in a way that addresses the barriers to energy storage and makes it or allows it to compete more fairly with other grid investment options. Usually this has been focused on planning processes. Most especially the initial activity in this space was focused on how do we better capture the benefits of energy storage and planning activities. And so there's a link there to a report we did a few months ago looking at emerging best practices. How are utilities actually identifying the limitations of their current planning models when it comes to energy storage and changing their practices in a way that overcomes those limitations? And what you can see there from this chart is that there's a lot of different ways of doing it. There are a lot of entry points to the planning process for improving the representation of energy storage. And so the objective of this report we did was to just help utilities, regulators, policymakers identify their options for improving the representation of energy storage in planning processes. Another thing we look at are demonstration programs. This is where the state is providing direct funding to a utility or other entity to deploy grid scale energy storage, utility scale front of the meter storage. And the idea here is that if we help utilities, kind of defer or diffuse that risk of investing in this new higher cost technology, it reduces the risk profile for the utility, makes them more willing to make those investments. It also facilitates utility learning. They learn how to operate this thing. They learn what it can do. In most cases where these demonstration programs have been implemented, you also see some kind of analytical reporting requirement where the goal of the state is to say, okay, what can we learn from these projects? What did they do well? What did they not do well? And how can that inform future investment? What you're seeing there is a graphic from a report that some of my colleagues at the lab did a couple years ago, looking at the Washington State Clean Energy Fund, which was one of the early demonstration funds that looked at, you can see 4 different energy storage projects that were built around the state and then tested against various uses to see how they performed. And PNNL did those analytics, and there's a link there to the final report of the benefits and the opportunities that they identified. Fourth kind of thing we look at are financial incentives. This is where the state is providing some form of direct financial benefit to end users, to customers, to deploy behind the meter storage on their facilities. These may be residential customers, commercial customers, industrial customers. But the idea here is that if you provide customers with that incentive to install behind the meter storage, you can help them manage their costs. You can also leverage that storage, leverage those investments in a way that benefits the grid and supports other objectives. So usually these are deployed in tandem with some kind of agreement where the utility is allowed to operate the storage to the benefit of the grid, or some kind of price signal to incent customers to use the storage in a way that's beneficial to the grid. And you can see a brief list there of different ways that states have gone about providing these benefits to customers. Maryland was the first state to do an income tax credit for storage investments. You see Virginia and New Hampshire there that have come at it from the sales tax or the property tax point of view, trying to reduce those costs to customers. And then you've got states like California and Connecticut that have provided direct incentives to customers to help defray the costs of storage investment. And in both those cases, California and Connecticut, they've taken a tiered approach where the incentive that you receive can be higher or lower depending on your income level, or in the case of California, also your vulnerability to certain risks like wildfires. There's priority investments for customers who have been affected by the public safety power shutoffs to help them keep the lights on when they're in that situation. Fifth kind of thing we look at are interconnection incentives. So interconnection standards, these are technical standards written by engineers to make sure that storage is connected to the grid safely and efficiently. But we've seen a number of states come out also from the policy side where they use the interconnection process in a way to send signals to customers to design and build and operate their systems in a way that benefits the grid. So one example of this is in Hawaii, where if you want to build a new rooftop PV system in Hawaii, you have three options. One is a controllable grid supply option where you have to basically agree to let the utility curtail you at their discretion. The second option is self-supply, where you say, okay, I'm going to keep all of my solar generation and consume it on site. I'm not going to send anything to the grid. Then the third option is called smart export, where you agree to only export to the grid during evening hours and nighttime hours when the utility actually needs it. So if you look at those last two options, energy storage is required. So if I, as a customer in Hawaii, want to maintain control over my solar system and get as much out of it as I can, I need to have energy storage in order to enable me to do that. And if a customer agrees to that self-supply option, because they're not exporting to the grid, that makes the interconnection study a lot simpler. And so they receive an expedited interconnection process. Arizona has a similar approach where they've taken a tiered approach to the interconnection study based on system characteristics. Another way of thinking about this, we've seen 3 states, Colorado, Nevada, and Illinois, that have adopted basically consumer rights laws that say, customers have a right to install energy storage, and that create a clear expectation that utilities and regulators need to have transparent and reasonable interconnection processes in place to support that. So how have these policies evolved over time? So there's 3 kind of overarching phases that we can think about. So phase 1 is open-ended. This is where states were just saying, we want storage on the grid. We're not particularly worried right now about what it's going to do or how it's going to operate. We just want to see it on the grid. So some examples of these are those early procurement targets where, it's just putting it on the grid to drive costs down and test the technology. Planning reforms where states are saying, we just want to make sure that our planning processes are capturing those opportunities where storage may be cost effective. Phase 2, it starts to get a little more focused. This is where a policy has, is deploying energy storage to a specific goal. We want to test storage's ability to do X or X and Y. So some examples of this are demonstration programs that test different uses, financial incentives to customers. And then phase 3, this is a new phase that we've only really seen unfolding in the last couple of years. This is the multifaceted phase. This is where states are starting to really enact kind of sweeping policies around energy storage. And usually it's not usually specifically about energy storage. It's usually part of a broader, climate bill or clean energy bill or something to that effect. But they're enacting sweeping policies around energy storage. So they're identifying multiple things that they expect storage to do. They're enacting multiple programs and initiatives and incentives around energy storage all at once. And so we've seen 3 states in particular do that just in the last year. And we'll talk about those a little bit in a moment. It can be helpful, at least to me. I had a lot of fun doing this exercise. I hope others appreciate it. To look at how these things have unfolded over time. So procurement targets. You can see that they really heated up, 2016 to 2018. You saw multiple states taking a couple swings at this where they installed they adopted one target, then came back a year or 2 later and increased it. California, New York, Massachusetts all did that. And it looks like procurement targets kind of start to fall off over the last few years. That's not necessarily true. And we'll talk about that in a moment. The second thing is regulatory adaptation. This is where you can really start to see how states' objectives for energy storage have started to change. So you have that outlier in 2013 where Hawaii put in some accelerated cost recovery mechanisms for storage and other investments of that type. But then you don't really see a lot of activity in this space till about 2017, 2018. But what you do see from all these states is just that planning guidance where they're saying, this is how we expect storage to be treated in plans. Again, not any specific objective, just trying to rethink planning processes and address the barriers to energy storage that exist in those processes. But then 2019, 2020, states start to get really specific and really creative about what they want storage to do. For example, You've got North Carolina in 2019 becoming the first state to enact requirements for the end of life disposal of energy storage assets, recycling, second life, whatever that may be, but actually putting requirements on developers to be responsible for that end of life disposal. Maine had this idea that they created a non-wires coordinator. And this is basically just an ombudsman that reviews all the transmission and distribution system plans in the state and identifies opportunities where non-wires alternatives like storage could have been considered, and then makes recommendations to the state and the utility to go back and look at other alternatives. In 2020, you've got Arizona becoming the first vertically integrated state that directed their utility to engage in third-party aggregation of behind-the-meter energy storage. So allowing customers to basically sell the output of their systems to a third party that can then sell those services to the third party, or excuse me, to the utility. You've seen California start to really think about how do you use storage in a way that improves the equity of the grid. And that's another thing we'll talk about in a moment. But again, states really starting to think about what can storage do and how do we enable it to do that. Demonstration programs. There's a few flavors of this. You've got programs like in Washington and Massachusetts where you have this very deliberate top-down approach to saying, these are the type of systems that we want to test. These are the types of values and uses that we want to test. And then, some heavy duty analytics around that to see, did it work? Is there value here? You've also got some smaller scale pilots like Maryland, where they're doing a pilot project or a pilot program for different ownership models where the utilities have to deploy, utility-owned storage or third-party owned storage or behind-the-meter storage, and just test how these different ownership models affect how the assets are used. You've also got the New York Rev Demo, where this is basically just an open-ended demonstration project where anyone can come to the Rev program and say, hey, I have this idea for how storage might benefit the grid. And there's a group that reviews it. If they think there's some value in it, they forward it on to the utilities. And we've actually seen, I think, 4 storage projects that were actually built as a result of this kind of open-ended demonstration project. Financial incentives, and still only active in a few states, but you can kind of see the trend over the last 2 or 3 years really towards sales tax exemptions, property tax exemptions, becoming the type of things that states are looking at frequently. Interconnection incentives, again, a couple ways of thinking about this, shaping how the interconnection process works, establishing behind the meter storage as a right for customers to have. And then we get into these multifaceted initiatives. And this is where a state, again, is doing a lot of things all at once. And I wanted to dive into those just a little bit here. So Maine, they enacted a procurement target last year, 400 megawatts by 2030, with the ability to increase that over time after 2030. But in addition to enacting the procurement target, they also put a lot of thought into, okay, what do we want this to do and how's it going to do it? So they have an independent energy efficiency administrator in Maine. Several states employ this model, but they took that administrator and they said, okay, you are also allowed to do load shifting. And so they put that in their into their mission statement. And so now they can use their incentives to also help customers deploy energy storage for load shifting. There was a resilience demonstration program there to put 15 megawatts at critical facilities to provide backup power. There was an initiative or a requirement for the Utility Commission to enact rate designs that send price signals to customers to incent energy storage to align with the cost of actually serving customers at different times of day. And there was also a market assessment to understand, okay, what are the barriers to reaching this target and what additional steps might be necessary. And then we already talked briefly about the non-wires coordinator position that they already had on the books there. So in Connecticut, they put a target of 1,000 megawatts by 2030 with some incremental targets along the way. And so to manage this target, what the regulator, the public utility regulator in Connecticut did was identify 7 specific objectives where they said, this is what we expect storage projects to do. These are the types of values and benefits that we'll be looking at when utilities propose projects. The legislation also required 580 megawatts, a little more than half of that target, to be behind the meter energy storage. So the state, the regulator looked at, okay, how do we break that down between different customer classes? How much comes from each type of customer? When do we expect to see it? Then they also established a financial incentive program to help customers deploy those behind the meter storage systems and actually achieve that target. And again, there's a tiered incentive structure so that customers who are coming from low income or some underserved demographic receive higher incentives to help them deploy storage and reap the benefits of the state's transition. Illinois passed the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, and I believe it was September last year. There is language there for a procurement target. It has not been put in place yet. The Illinois Commerce Commission has until the end of this year to determine what that target should be. But in addition to creating the infrastructure for that target, what this bill does, well, I should say up front, this bill really has this idea of an equitable transition towards a clean energy grid interwoven through it. Making sure that all customers are participating, all customers are benefiting, and you can see that throughout the bill. The first program that it does is this coal transition, this $280 million ratepayer funded program to replace retired coal facilities with solar plus storage generation facilities. And then there's some requirements for each of those facilities to have labor agreements and pay prevailing wages and opportunities for displaced coal plant workers to have employment in their construction. There's also kind of an overarching equity requirement where all the investments that come as a result of this act will be subject to equity standards that will be developed by the Illinois Power Agency. There's a requirement that solar and storage projects be deployed in some specifically identified communities that have historically borne outsized impacts from electric grid operations. And then finally, there's a requirement for utilities to provide compensation to customers who have solar plus storage system. And what's really unique here that we haven't really seen anywhere else yet is that the legislation actually requires the utility to carry the costs of any communications infrastructure that's necessary to enable those behind the meter systems to participate in regional markets. So Virginia, they have, it was the biggest target until recently, 3,100 megawatts. And so what they've done is they've broken it down, put in some interim targets, but they've also they've thought about how do we actually procure this. And so they've invested a lot of effort into developing a very clear, very transparent procurement process, these annual competitive, transparent solicitations to procure these energy storage assets. They also allow the utilities to propose behind the meter incentives for customers. Though in this case, the regulator or the legislature isn't determining what those should be, just allowing the utility to propose them. The regulator in Virginia also provided some guidance around what benefits they expect to see, the types of uses that they'll be prioritizing and considering when they review the projects that come in. And then it was unique at the time. The legislation would have required utilities to have a way of aggregating behind the meter storage and selling it into markets. FERC Order 2222, which requires all markets to do that anyway, kind of superseded that. But again, at the time, it was a creative requirement. And an important note here, these 4 states that we've talked through that have done it kind of on a sweeping basis over the last couple of years, a procurement target is not required. You don't have to do this all at once. So there's a couple examples here of states that have put together really cohesive energy storage strategies kind of on an incremental basis and without a procurement target, just again to show the flexibility here. So in Arizona, they've had multiple types of demonstration programs and incentives to test behind the meter storage at the residential level, at the commercial level. They're the only state, or only vertically integrated state that has required their utility to work with third-party aggregators. So that aggregator can again bundle those behind the meter systems and sell them to the utility, or their output to the utility. And then a clear process for how customers will interconnect with the grid and how their system characteristics will inform how that process will unfold. In North Carolina, again, only state that we're aware of that has, a requirement on the books for storage developers to be responsible for the end-of-life management of their systems. There's some financial incentives in place. There's some planning processes in place. Again, lots of different ways of figuring out where to fit storage in the grid and how it fits in with the state's broader energy policies. So emerging objectives and future opportunities. So there's this idea of energy democratization that kind of runs through a lot of these policies, especially a lot of the recently enacted one, where there's a real emphasis on behind the meter storage, on customer-sided storage, and making sure that customers directly benefit from the deployment of energy storage technologies. You've seen a lot of states that have really high solar generation, like Arizona, California, Hawaii, provide incentives through either direct payments or interconnection processes to get that distributed storage on the grid to help manage that distributed solar. A couple things to keep in mind here, though, is that not all customers have the same access to these technologies. And that's something that some states have explicitly recognized and addressed, but not every state has. Sometimes that can be a blind spot in these processes. And another thing is like aggregation. It's a great idea. It's a very complex thing to do. So, figuring out how to actually aggregate these things is going to be a challenge in a lot of regions. A couple regions have already kind of figured this out or are close to figuring it out. But, an Order 2222 is going to help with that. But in the vertically integrated regions, there's still a lot of question marks around the ability to aggregate and provide services from behind the meter systems. Another emerging objective that's closely related is this idea of energy system equity. Energy storage, it's scalable, it's flexible. You can put it just about anywhere on the grid and you can make it do a lot of different things. And so because of that scalability and flexibility, you can use it to build equity in a lot of ways. You can use it to reduce local emissions, the burdens the health burdens that populations face from nearby emissions. You can use it to manage energy costs. You can use it to build community wealth. We're starting to see more and more states think about equity. The Illinois bill, for example, to really think about how equity and storage interface. But there's still a lot of opportunity, again, because there's so many different ways that you could think about storage as an equity asset. There's a lot of opportunity for states to explore this. And a couple resources here. Some of my colleagues did a report last year looking at how energy storage can help support equity goals. And then we have an initiative here at the lab that we're working on with Sandia National Laboratories, looking at how we can help local communities around the country use storage or leverage storage to reach their goals around equity and community development. Couple of other emerging objectives. Resilience is an idea that's kind of mentioned in a few of these policies. Connecticut had that backup generation program, for example. This is kind of a challenging topic, though. We don't have standards that govern resilience the same way that we have for like reliability or other grid services. So, when a policy says we want to do resilience, it has to be very specific around what it means when it says resilience and how specifically storage and other technologies are going to be used to provide that resilience. And there's a link there to a report we did that kind of thinks through, from a planning perspective, how can you incorporate energy storage into resilience planning? And then targeted grid support. Again, states are starting to get a lot more specific around what they expect storage to do for the grid. Things like peak shaving, resource adequacy, decarbonization, infrastructure deferral. But we still have a lot to learn about energy storage and the benefits they can provide to the grid and the things that it can do. So some future opportunities for policies to consider. One is market transformation for long duration storage technologies. These early procurement targets, like we talked about, were designed to drive market transformation, force the thing onto the grid and get costs down so that it can be competitive in the future. As we get more and more variable generation on the grid and as customer loads get more and more varying around things like distributed generation, electric vehicles, electrification, those mismatches between when energy is produced and when it is needed are getting bigger and bigger. So there's a growing need for long duration energy storage to start being deployed on the grid to bring those variable generation and variable supply, or excuse me, variable supply and variable demand back in harmony. The challenge though is that, like, if you look at our planning processes and our policies now, we're not really sending clear signals, clear investment signals for long duration storage technologies. You know, the grid storage launchpad is designed to test that next generation of technologies, including long duration technologies, but there's not really a strong case right now to be made for those technologies. It's difficult to line up investment dollars. It's difficult to do that R&D because we don't have those clear policies in place. So state policy making can be, you know, it provides a huge opportunity for states to send those signals, those supportive signals for research and research and development of long duration technologies. Another opportunity, recycling, end of life management. You know, we're putting a lot of storage on the grid, which is great, but we also need to think about that's a big future waste stream that we're also creating. You know, we've only got one state that we're aware of that has specific requirements for end of life management. You know, and again, battery recycling is still a nascent technology. There's still a lot we have to learn and figure out about how to do it effectively and efficiently. So again, state policy, a tremendous opportunity to provide those signals and to invest and develop the technologies and processes that we'll need to manage that waste stream. Another potential future opportunity for state policy is to test new uses of energy storage. You know, there's some ideas out there, you know, using storage as a transmission asset, as a core grid infrastructure, could potentially have major impacts on the electric grid, but, you know, these uses are still conceptual. They haven't really been tested. Equity, another example of a use case that still has a lot of potential to explore. What you see there is a graphic from a report we've done in our Energy Storage as Core Infrastructure series. You know, the idea here is that anything else that we buy as consumers has storage embedded into its supply chain. You know, water, electronics, food. You know, it's warehouses, it's granaries, it's reservoirs. That storage function is built into the supply chain. Electricity is the only thing we buy that doesn't have that, because the technology wasn't there when we built the grid. Now that we have that technology, that ability to just drop storage in the grid wherever it makes sense, could we kind of retrofit the grid, change the way we operate the grid in a way that it has that embedded storage function? And so you see here just kind of an example of on the natural gas side of the house, if we've got a city that requires 1 million cubic feet per day, a really simple example, on average, but then has peak demand of 1.5 million cubic feet. Because I have storage built into the natural gas system, I can design this whole upstream system based on average demand, and I only have to design that last mile based on peak demand. So that creates efficiencies in the system. That reduces the amount of infrastructure I have to buy. It builds more flexibility in the system. We don't have that on electricity. If our average demand is 100 megawatts and then it grows to 125 megawatts at peak, we have to build the whole system to support that 125 megawatt demand, even if we're only there a few days a year or a few hours a year. So again, if we had storage embedded in the electric system the way it is in the natural gas system, could we extract greater efficiencies from the existing system? Could we reduce costs? So anyways, there's a link there to this initiative that we're looking at, Energy Storage as Core Infrastructure. There's a series of reports we've done, a lot more coming as well. Another future opportunity is in the area of codes and safety standards. Our first webinar presentation in this series talked about code and safety standards. If you've missed it, I highly suggest going back and looking at it. You know, codes and safety standards for energy storage are complex. You can see here just a simple diagram about, if we're just talking about one energy storage system, here are all the different codes and standards that affect the various components of it and how it interacts with the grid. These are national standards, international standards that are updated every 2 to 3 years based on, you know, what we learn as we deploy more systems. When systems fail, you know, what went wrong, we learn from that, we incorporate it into the codes and standards. The challenge here is that, you know, these codes and standards have to be adopted on a state-by-state basis. And that's a complex process. You know, there's cost benefit analyses that many states require. There's hearings that need to be done. And one of the challenges that we've heard from several states is that there's not always funding for that work to be done, for that analysis and that process to be done. So you see states starting to fall behind. They're 1, 2, maybe even 3 cycles behind on their fire and electrical codes. And when we're talking about energy storage, where we're learning more every day and every code cycle has significant new upgrades, being 2 or 3 cycles behind can be a big deal. There's a lot of safety provisions that the state may be missing if it has fallen behind. So, so the message here, and, I say this as a former state regulator developing energy policies who did not really think about codes and safety standards, to my embarrassment now. There's a space here for policymakers, for regulators to think about codes and safety considerations in the policies as they develop them. Just basically we shouldn't neglect codes and safety as we're trying to figure out where energy storage fits in broader goals. So, just a few summary takeaways here. Energy storage, it's uniquely flexible and scalable. The transformational impact it has on the grid, it can't really be overstated. We've never had a technology like this where we can put it anywhere on the grid and ask it to do just about anything. And because of that, state policy making on energy storage has accelerated in recent years. It's also diversified in recent years. States are starting to really explore all the different things that storage can do in support of their broader policy goals. And when it comes to these policies, there aren't really, it's not about best practices. There's no like silver bullet or best way of doing things. It's more helpful to think of this as just, this is a toolbox with a lot of tools in it, a lot of room for states to adapt different ideas and different policies and different approaches to their specific needs. And as we do that, there's a lot of uses for energy storage that still haven't fully been explored. How do we use storage to improve equity? How do we use storage how do we embed storage in the grid in a way that will change grid up, make the grid more flexible, I guess I should say. Just a few of the examples of the use cases that we're just starting to scratch the surface. And so state policies can be an effective tool, a valuable part of the process of, exploring these new use cases, figuring out how storage plays in these different applications, but also in providing and signals for the research and development into the next generation of storage technologies, new chemistries for storage, longer duration storage technologies. States have an excellent track record of providing those investment signals. And that's an ongoing opportunity for states to think about as they adopt new policies. And so with that, I think we're at the end of the presentation. I just want to put in a plug, as Vince mentioned up front, through that Office of Electricity program, we provide technical assistance to states. So, if there's a state out there that has questions or is trying to think through about how storage fits into the process, that's what we're here for. Don't hesitate to reach out. I'll turn it over to you, Rebecca.
Great, thank you, Jeremy. That was outstanding, and you have many questions. So I'm going to talk for a second while you get the water that you need after talking for so long. Hi, everyone. I'm Rebecca O'Neill at PNNL. I'm a colleague of Jeremy's, and I have some questions in the chat about a variety of topics that you raised. So maybe we'll start with long duration, Jeremy. So there are a lot of questions about, there are many different types of technologies, and I think you were quite careful not to talk too specifically about technology types, but we have some questions about how are state policies interacting with different types of long duration technologies. So do you see any opportunities for states to delineate durations or delineate ideal technology characteristics that maybe create barriers or opportunities for certain technology types? The specific example, one that was given here, was hydrogen, for example. Do you see any kinds of technology specific procurements or any other types of attributes of storage that are coming from states directly? Oh, you're muted. Yes. There we are.
Okay, there we go. Sorry about that. Yeah, that is a great question. This is an area that is ripe for state activity. The only state I'm aware of that's really started to think about long duration at a state level, well, there's a couple. Oregon put out they did a resolution on long duration storage, I think in their last session, or maybe the session before, where they said, hey, long duration storage is wonderful and we would love to have some. But that's about as far as it went. California has gone a little bit farther. They've proposed some specific funding programs for long duration storage. I don't think those have gone through yet, but I know that Governor Newsom has been trying to get those through. The California, like the Public Utilities Commission in California, which does integrated planning for the state, has identified a need for long duration storage, which I believe they said is 10 hours or more, if I remember correctly, where they like, we need this technology, and they've started to kind of rethink their planning in a way that says, okay, where, like, what do we need? When do we need it? How much do we need? But, you know, just from a policy standpoint, you know, I think I'm a big fan, I'm a big supporter of technology agnostic policies, where we're not saying we want technology X on the grid, where we're saying we're defining the policy in terms of the grid needs. We're like, we need something that can meet this need, that can provide 10 hours of storage, 20 hours of storage, seasonal storage, whatever that need may be. And then just, you know, seeing what shows up. You know, hydrogen is one that gets gets a lot of credit for this, or there's a lot of conversation about hydrogen. You know, one of the challenges with hydrogen is that it has very low round trip efficiency. When you think about, you know, using electricity to make hydrogen, then burning hydrogen to make electricity, that initial electricity that you had, you're only going to get about, you know, 35, maybe 40, if you're lucky, % of it back. So you know, it may make sense in niche situations, but I think that the key point is that there is no silver bullet technology for long duration storage yet. There are candidates out there. There are potential technologies out there. There's hydrogen, there's liquefied air, there's above ground compressed air, there's molten salt. There's a lot of technologies that are kind of waiting in the wings. But again, I think that we need to have policies that say, yes, we need long duration storage. We need storage that can do X for Y amount of time. And then, you know, see which one of those technologies, or which several of those technologies are able to show up.
So building on something you just mentioned now about conversion losses and round trip efficiency. So different storage units have different characteristics and round trip efficiency. A lot of that is documented in some of the cost and performance reports that have been published in the last year. One person asked specifically about how losses in behind the meter storage might have surprised some customers, and asked, are you hearing any feedback from those addressing behind the meter storage on the impact of power conversion losses and the impact on the customer's usage and bill, which I interpret to be, is there a way that policy is hearing back from customers that are installing the storage units that's not performing as expected?
I'm not aware of anything to that effect. I would be very interested in hearing, or, you know, learning about that if others are. You know, behind the meter storage, it's pretty much all lithium ion, I think. I'm not sure if there's anything else out there. I don't think there is. You know, so it's going to be around 80 to 85% round trip efficiency. So, I mean, as long as, I would say that as long as, well, maybe I shouldn't say that. If time of use rates are in place that capture the differential of the different costs of serving customers at different times of the day, I would expect that those round trip losses would be certainly diminished, maybe, you know, maybe not even be as big a factor. There may still be net positive benefits. I'm not sure. I'd be really interested in hearing more about that.
Okay, we'll follow up with the person who asked that question to see what generated it. Another set of questions that are in the chat have to do with your last couple slides about embedded storage and about storage as transmission. Asking, are you seeing IOUs, investor-owned utilities, and utility commissions have higher interest in rate-basing long-duration storage addition? So I think that's just true in general for any storage. Are you seeing a lot of willingness to rate-base storage investments and for other purposes? I think that was part of the indication there behind the IOUs, is multi-purpose storage.
Yeah, I mean, I think when it comes to rate-basing, you know, I don't think we have to reinvent any wheels here, you know, as a former regulator. You know, when something comes to a regulator for rate basing, it's just going to be, you know, what is the need? What are the options that were considered? And can you demonstrate that this is the least cost, least risk option? You know, is this the most reasonable option? I don't think we need to come up with any new creative ways of doing this. The challenge, like, long duration storage right now, it's this kind of nebulous idea. But if you look at, again, the size of those disconnects between when generation occurs and when it's needed in a decarbonized system, they're enormous. There are enormous gaps between the two. I firmly believe that long duration storage will be an absolute necessity to achieve a decarbonized grid. The challenge is identifying those needs in advance and sending those signals so that the technologies show up so that they're cost competitive and reasonable when we need them. If we just, come up with a plan in 2030 that says, oh, we need long duration storage next year, it might not be there. But if we come up with a plan next year, the year after that says, oh, we need long duration storage in 2032, maybe that's doable. That sends a much better signal.
So you just used a word that also generated a lot of questions, which was decarbonization. There are some questions about emissions attribution to storage technologies and the role of storage in decarbonization policy. Any thoughts on that topic?
Yeah, I think I like to cook and I like to put onions in everything because I think onions soak up flavor and distribute flavor. And I think of storage as kind of like the onion, like it soaks up the characteristics of the grid that you put it in. If you put storage in a grid with a lot of emitting generations, it will increase emissions, yes, because if it's charging and then if it's charging from emitting sources and then having those round trip losses and then discharging, yes, it increased emissions objectively. So I think of storage as a tool. Storage in and of itself isn't increasing emissions, isn't decreasing emissions, but it's just a tool in a system that has high emissions or has low emissions. And as we deploy variable generation technology in pursuit of decarbonization goals, again, those differences between when energy is generated and when it's needed, they need to be brought back together. There needs to be a buffer that sits in between, solar that's on all day and customer needs overnight, for example. That's a really simple example. There's a lot of technologies out there right now. There's a lot of technologies we're just starting to look at, offshore wind. It's unclear, what nuclear will be like, small modular nuclear reactors, for example. We don't know, what a decarbonized grid looks like right now. But if you were to assume that we were to do it with the technologies that we have that are commercially available right now, yeah, that's where you really start to see those sizable gaps. And maybe, other technologies will show up that reduce the size of those gaps, that make it a little easier to match supply and demand. But looking at it, what our objectives are now with the technologies we have now, we need something sitting in between to bring supply and demand back together. And it's pretty sizable.
Let me ask you the question that was specifically asked in a couple examples, and I think your work touches on it. So one case, the question was, whether the strategy for storage, any views on whether it's efficient or lower cost emissions and grid system value, all of those values stacked, whether it's better to think about hybrid renewables and storage at the edge of the grid or standalone grid storage. And of course, that brings up your concepts about storage as core infrastructure, but also the work that you did for thinking about storage as transmission and some of the really big central systems like pump storage that we've had for some time and are using in that fashion as supporting transmission. So all of the ways that storage can be deployed. How does policy interact with those different strategies, just given a broad decarbonization goal? Complicated.
All at once kind of question. Yeah. So right now, the policies that we have are all about pushing storage out to the edge. So, all these behind the meter policies push it out to the edge. The investment tax credit has pushed it out to the other edge where it's with generators. And so we're sitting with storage at the edge, and it's a matter of visibility. If I have behind the meter storage at my house, it can serve me, and it can provide some support on my circuit. and that's the extent of its visibility. If I have storage paired with a generator, I can make that generator flexible. I can, do some flexible output for that generator, but that's the only flexibility I can provide, really, especially if I'm DC coupled. So I'm not saying that those are bad. It's bad to do those things. Like, it's great. Like, again, it's great to have flexibility in the grid wherever we can get it. It just becomes a question of, if we put storage in the middle of the grid, if we put it at a substation where it can see multiple circuits, where it can interact with the bulk power system, it has much more visibility, can provide flexibility across a much wider spectrum. And so that's kind of the question that we're asking is this feasible? Is it beneficial? Would it be desirable? And again, this is just something that's still very much in the conceptual phase that we're just starting to really analyze and study. But the conceptual idea is that in the middle, it can provide flexibility everywhere. At the edges, it can only provide flexibility where it's at.
That's very well said. I see a lot of questions are coming through in the chat where people are asking questions about technology and why we're not talking about pump storage, why we're not talking about thermal energy storage. And maybe you could maybe this is a great way to finish, is just to touch on this tension of different technologies for storage and their attributes, and the way that the policy and regulatory landscape is operating right now vis-a-vis so many technology types and attributes. Because I think this is a challenge we face as well at PNNL, is how to work in both of those worlds effectively.
Yeah, and I'm just sorry, I'm looking and I'm seeing a lot of questions about things like thermal storage and building storage and pump hydro storage. And I just want to be clear that when we say storage, at least at the lab, we're agnostic. We're aware that a lot of what's out there is lithium ion and pump storage. But our point of view is we're agnostic. Different technologies have different challenges. Pump storage hydro does big storage, long duration storage, but it's really big and it's really expensive and it's difficult for one or even two utilities to do it. You kind of need this pooled approach, and we're not very good at doing that kind of joint construction from the grid perspective anyway. So yeah, I just want to go back to I think the policies are best when they're technology agnostic, and we're just saying we're defining things in terms of what the grid needs, what customers need, what our broader objectives are, and then just again, seeing what's available, seeing what shows up. But if we're very clear about what those needs are, we send the right type of signals for research and development and deployments in support of those goals.
Thank you. Everyone asked wonderful questions. I appreciate it. It was a challenge to try to bring some of them together, but thanks everyone for putting some great questions for Jeremy in the chat. Appreciate the opportunity. Over to you, Vince.
All right, thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Jeremy, for your presentation today. Want to thank all of you for attending and all for the active questions and chat we had going on, and several of those we'll try to reach out to you personally to answer if we didn't get to it within the chat. So I did want to highlight, if we can call up the slide, our next one in our series. We'll see if it's coming up. There we go. So in 2 weeks, May 26th, our own Rebecca O'Neill, who you just saw today moderating the Q&A, is going to be speaking on energy storage for social equity. After that, Srinivas will be buildings as a storage asset. And then June 23rd, we'll be looking at the reliability test lab work with David Reed. So those are the next in our upcoming webinar series. Hope to see you again in 2 weeks. And thank you all for your attendance and great questions. Take care and have a good day.